Welcome back, everybody, into Bill's Chat. I am Josh McCarty. With me tonight, as always, is Luka. Luka, I think we have our first post-game show, kind of, sort of.
Yep. In 2024, well, in the season of 2024, not in 2024. This is our first post-game show back in the seat behind the mic with a game of sorts to talk about afterwards and kind of give our fresh eyes and takes on it. Um, it is what it was, and we'll get into that. It's not as exactly what we would call exciting to discuss, but overall, it's fun. It's fun to be back in this situation, Josh, because this only means we're 1 week closer to when the actual fun begins. And that I know you and I are both very much looking forward to.
It's such a tricky path to figure out what matters in these preseason games. And I was even thinking today, like, how many Bills preseason games can I really remember? And to me, it's the ones that stand out for like horrible reasons, like the night that Matt Barkley had to punt because the Matt Ariza stuff came down and they made him inactive, or the old Buffalo quarterback Tyree Jackson, like led a comeback drive in Buffalo. That was cool. AJ McCarron's like wild random comeback against the Lions, and then he got cut the week or traded a week later. That was cool. EJ Manuel like hushing the crowd in Cleveland when he was the third stringer at that point in his career, and it was like, buddy, you're the third stringer in the fourth quarter of a preseason game. You led a fourth quarter drive against guys who will be driving milk trucks next week. But things like that. This one might be one we remember just because it is kind of a unique final score, 33-6. I will say, Luka, I'm a big believer that there may be no more insignificant part of a preseason game than the final score. I almost never care who wins or who loses outside of, I guess I would rather my team win. So if it comes down to it, sure, like cool. But I do think that while I don't ever panic over preseason, I don't ever think, oh man, the sky is falling, or conversely, like, oh God, we've got this stud team. I do think that within the 60 minutes of this 33-6 game, there probably is some value we can take out of it, some learnings we can take out of it, both good and bad. And that is what we will try to do tonight. But right off the cuff, I will ask you, because I know, it's common, and there's a lot of folks out there that you wait all these months to see your team take the field again. They do, and they lose 33-6. And it's human nature to be like, well, that wasn't what I wanted to see. How worried should people be after this result?
No different than what they were beforehand. And that's coming from myself. So I'm only going to speak for myself, but I'm a firm believer in that. It's one of those things where you look, you can try to dissect the preseason game as best as you want. You can look for those highs. You can look to criticize the lows. You can try to read between the lines of what you just watched and why you spent the time to watch what you just watched and what is going on. First and foremost, it was a prime example of why I am not an individual that cares for watching preseason as a whole. That was a beautiful example of that. And two, it's because realistically, I just think it takes a lot of talking into to get you into a place where you believe you're reading between the lines, you're taking something from it. It can be fun where you look at a splash play, such as, just enjoying Shakir catching the ball and turning upfield, seeing Keon Coleman make a reception, all of those little sprinkle items. Cool. Enjoy those for what they are, but all they quite literally are is one play and it's a friendly, it's a meaningless game. The only meaning and the only value that comes from it, I truly believe, are just those detail things. A lot of the penalties pre-snap especially came later on in that game, and that's going to be stuff that almost, I think coaches, I'm not going to say coaches want to see, but it's going to be something come Monday that they clearly are going to highlight, they're going to talk about, they're going to reinforce just certain things that they want the entire team, even the first team, people that weren't part of those things, they're going to be like, make sure we're not doing this, make sure we're not hurting ourselves. We heard Sean McDermott post-game talk about a lot of self-inflicted issues and everything going on. And that's a coach's dream, in my opinion, when it comes to preseason, because it gives you that excuse to be a coach and instill things that clearly a guy like McDermott and talks about culture and all of that kind of stuff. It just reinforces that and it allows it to kind of be a springboard to other things that you want to do. Other than that, You should not read anything more into this. It should not create any more panic. I was in an environment during the game and after the game where people were reciting the score, and I heard some things, and I constantly had to I just ignored half of them. I'll just be straight with that one. And then two, when someone came up to me to directly talk about it or around me, whether I was with friends or whatever, I would just tell them all the time. I couldn't care less. I just
Mhm.
could not care less. It's quite literally a game that took place. The thing I'm happy about is no injuries realistically came out of it. We obviously Ed Oliver scare was there. He got cleared 2 minutes later and he's fine, but you keep him on the sideline. That's fine.
Mhm.
All of those things happened. And then the classic like period to the sentence is always and forever will be the 16-0 Patriots went 0-4 in the preseason, and the 0-16 Lions went 4-0 in those preseasons. That both happened. That's just how this works. Preseason doesn't matter. Move on with your life. Just it's preseason. This is the time to get out all the BS. Let the depth players try to earn their spot, whether it's on your roster or another one, and move on with your life. It's quite as simple as that.
I think when you see the 33-6 final score, it can be jarring. I think context is important here. Josh Allen threw 3 passes in this game. He had 2 drives. One was a 3 and out. And then one was a drive that went pretty well, but then it went into the second quarter and McDermott pulled him mid-drive, and then Trubisky came in and the Bills ended up with a field goal. So the Bills starters then played a couple more drives with Trubisky, and at halftime, this game was 6-3 Chicago. Okay, 6-3. It wound up 33-6. The fourth quarter of this game was 20-0 Chicago. So if you understand how preseason football goes and you understand who was on the field and who was off the field when that 20-point swing happened, it's a lot easier to understand. I probably shouldn't care too much about the final score. I will also say this. Luka and I are both people that survived the 17-year playoff drought. And this is not me saying like, oh, we're better fans than you because we're older than you, because that literally all you're doing is flexing your age at that point when you say that. But I'll just provide some context here. Preseason mattered more to me back then. When the Bills would come off of a mediocre season and they'd try Trent Edwards out there again as their starting quarterback, and it was like your name here at offensive line, Dick Duran at head coach. Yeah, a game where they don't move the ball at all would irritate you, because you're like, have you guys gotten any better than what we saw last year? This is a Bills team that was quite honestly excellent last year. They made it to the second round of the playoffs. They won their last 6 games of the season despite a midseason offensive coordinator change. Their quarterback should have been at least more in the conversation for MVP. So I'm not in panic mode because game 1 of the preseason didn't go well. And I'm also not at all in panic mode because the final score was 33-6, because the Bills' third string cornerback, Shane Buechele, I'm not overly confident how to say his name. I'm pretty confident I'll never really have to learn it, Luka, because I will tell you, I went back and watched this game. I don't know why. I felt like an obligation to. And in the spirit of Madden coming out this week, this is how I would tell you I would describe his performance. I put a tweet out there about this. He looked like a kid who picked up Madden for the first time, had no idea what any of the buttons did. All he wanted to do was boot up Madden and just have fun running around with Lamar Jackson making circus plays. But the problem is, Luka, he loaded into the game. He picked the wrong purple team and he had Sam Darnold instead of Lamar Jackson. That's what he looked like. He was bailing out of pockets so fast, running in circles with no plan and getting sacked. It was hilarious. I've never seen anything like that. And it was kind of funny to watch. It reminds me, was it Chris Sims' brother who in one preseason like threw a pass backwards to somebody, or I forget, there was Matt Sims, and
Yeah, I think you're right.
it just after that, I don't know. That to me is what stood out. We're going to get into some of the nuts and bolts here. I will say, if we want to start with something positive, let's do that. I thought that the John Perry experiment, it's not an experiment, he's going to be here. The John Perry hire, the former NFL referee who the Bills have now brought onto their staff to be extra eyes in the booth. McDermott went 2 for 2 on challenges. And one of those challenges, I cannot remember the scenario. I'm not talking about the Cole Kmet catch on the sideline where he was out of bounds, because I thought he was out of bounds when it happened. But it was the first challenge. I didn't even think they should challenge it because it didn't strike me as something that went against them, but they did and they won. McDermott's somebody that historically, Luka, has not been good on challenges. So I do think having those extra eyes in the booth will be good, not only for like, oh, you should challenge that, because I think anybody with a football background can look at a replay and just determine if you should challenge it. But also the what's the benefit here? What's the net gain of winning this challenge versus the risk of losing the timeout? And I also like the fact that he's up in the booth with the eye in the sky view where he's watching basically all 22 all game long. So if he notices something like a defensive back on the other team is getting away with holding every play, or an offensive lineman on the other team is jumping a little early, he can voice down to McDermott and say, hey, let the refs know this is going on. It's only going to produce good things for the Bills. So I think it was a good sign, step one, that it came out looking this good.
It's little detailed items that can make a big difference as things progress. And that's one of those items, right? If you're trying to pull something out of this game and kind of see where maybe improvement has already been made, that is a quite black and white one right there. It does seem like that additional staff member is something that McDermott clearly needs to help him be a more solid head coach on the sideline, because that being his and his previous staff's job without that kind of advisory role there that would have a little bit more of an in-depth eye, or even just have the ability to solely pay attention to that, was clearly needed. Because as you had pointed out, McDermott has always struggled with those certain things in key moments when it comes to, is it truly worth the challenge? Is this going to be a challenge you actually have a very good chance of winning? So on and so forth in that world, as well as, excuse me, no one else really has the time of day to be paying attention to it at that detail level, like you're talking about with, hey, this appears to be going on, things like that. They could be all, I mean, that individual's job, John Perry's job, is quite literally on how to grease the game from officiating level. That's what his job is. And he can assist McDermott in that, because head coaches do have a responsibility in their own right to work with the officiating crew, point out certain things, kind of make sure the game is being well officiated in their eyes. And both coaches have that right? It is a give and take kind of situation from both sidelines. You never want to go, cross the line when it comes to that. But overall, the officials are human. They're going to miss things. You need to just have someone that has the ability to hold them accountable, make sure they're aware of things, stuff like that. We've all heard through all the years of anyone being a sports fan how, hey, 32 is grabbing out there. Hey, this guy's jumping off the snap a little bit too quick, stuff like that. And coaches have been doing that forever. Now you have someone up, as you said, eye in the sky, who can kind of see the whole picture and see when these things are happening. And that is their job, just to kind of make sure when McDermott's making those claims, it has a little bit of foundation to it. And I do think, for what it's worth, these officials do their homework. They know who's on staff. They know who they need to look for. I'm sure then they're aware that an individual like John Perry is on staff now for the Bills. So if something's coming through McDermott's mouth, I would like to think that they understand it might not be just because the head coach himself is thinking this. It's probably because he's hearing something in his ears that's telling them that. And they should probably respect it a little bit more at all, just to kind of give that attention to whatever it is the complaint might be, or the discussion in general. So it's overall, I love that you just put big deal question mark. You presented it that way. I do think it's a big deal, because I think in two ways it's a big deal. One, the Bills are exploring all different manners on how to improve. It's not just simple X's and O's on the field. It's not simple personnel on the field and just players on offense and defense that they believe they need to change and do something to win. There's other facets to the game that they clearly believe that they need to get better at, and this is one of those fields. And two, you do now kind of alleviate a little bit of pressure off of McDermott's plate, and he can just be more responsible in a comfortable area where he can depend on another individual in his staff, which clearly he is doing, and it's working, at least in the very entry level that it is right now. And he can just focus on his job and do that at a high level like we all know he can. So I think those two things make this a big deal and make it a big positive overall moving forward. And you just hope that it continues that way. And maybe we do see kind of that attention to detail, success on challenges, all of that kind of stuff. Just amplify ourselves, and maybe that by the cherry on top with this, Josh, would be a key moment where that comes up and that turns a loss into a win, because it feels like it only happens the other way.
Right.
It really does. Even through all these years of success, it only feels like it's the other way. If we see that kind of pendulum swing and we see it go to the positive direction, I think that would kind of, one win would quite literally pay for itself at that point.
I agree 100%. And, I think you can say what you want to about Sean McDermott, but I think he's proven in his now 7 years as Bills coach that he's willing to turn over every stone to see where he can improve. And this is just the latest example. So what we're going to do tonight, and just so everybody knows, the Bills have a preseason game coming up next week against Pittsburgh, but it's a unique week where they're going to be scrimmaging against Pittsburgh throughout the week. So generally, when teams scrimmage against each other leading up to a preseason game, you don't see the starters then turn around and play in that game. But Josh Allen only threw 3 passes. Russell Wilson for the Steelers wasn't even active last week. So I do wonder what that's going to look like as the week goes on. But I think this is going to be a pretty interesting week to watch the Bills. I don't know what access we'll have to those practices because I don't believe they're open unless the Steelers are still quote unquote in training camp, and then people can still watch it. But I think that they're closed practices. That'll be fun to track. All right. Well, what we're going to do for the show, though, Luka, is I put out a question on Twitter that I think will help guide a lot of the conversations I wanted to bring up, because there were some points I wanted to bring up, things I liked, things I didn't like. I put out a question on Twitter, and we're going to hit on all those points tonight just based on the responses we got. So the question is, training camp is over, and we've played one preseason game. What Bill's opinion of yours, if any, has changed in a significant way in the last 2 months? So as to say, what you thought in June is now way different, or at least significantly enough different that you've moved off your original spot in what you've seen in training camp. And then if you want to factor in the preseason game, feel free to as well. Luka, anything come to mind for you that has changed at least somewhat significantly?
Whew. That's a good one. I don't know if anything's changed too significantly where I would kind of like want to pound the table at it. At least we'll say that level. I will say that realistically, I'm surprised I still have as many question marks as I do. I feel like I would already be a little bit more comfortable than I normally am at this point, other seasons. And that's where I'm concerned, because I actually can't pinpoint where that's coming from. And that is actually the concern. I'm concerned that I don't really have any direct concerns.
Well,
that would be the way to put it.
Here's one that I think would be true for both of us dating back to June, because we did a show and we talked about who could be a surprise cut. And a name you brought up was Damar Hamlin. You may have seen this in the notes and thought you shouldn't say anything on it because you thought I was going to bring it up. But we both thought Damar Hamlin could be a roster bubble guy. But injuries and, guys behind him that maybe we thought were going to be playing better, like D. Delaney, just have not factored in whatsoever. And our guy, Chris Janke, who we interact with a lot on Twitter, says Damar Hamlin's chances of making the roster has increased exponentially. And boy, has it, Luka. We both thought in June this could be a roster bubble guy. And now it feels like he's the odds-on favorite to win the safety job. And I will say, because of that, no knock on Damar Hamlin, my confidence in the safeties is significantly lower than it was in June. And if you had told me at the end of last season, after watching last season, that the Bills were going to start the season with Damar Hamlin and Taylor Rapp as their 2 starting safeties, my next question to you would be, what went wrong? Because there are 2 big moves this offseason to get better at safety. We're spending a 2nd-round pick on Cole Bishop and then signing Mike Edwards to a decent free agent deal, veteran deal, decent size. But that were their 2 big swings to fix the position, and both those guys are hurt. And I respect everything that the Bills are saying to us about Taylor Rapp, about how he's taken ownership of that room, about how he's like the new Micah Hyde and Jordan Poyer in that room. I can't forget what I saw last year where he looked like a fish out of water in coverage at times. And when he was asked to play deep, it did not look like a strength of his game. I go back to Damar Hamlin post-incident in Cincinnati. I use the word incident because I'm just not sure what the appropriate way to describe it is. So I apologize if that's offensive, but I'm just trying to, do right by him. And I feel like he was emerging as a player, but I never, even at his best, felt like this is a long-term answer for the Bills at safety. And then since he's been back on the field, I haven't seen anything that told me like this is going to be the guy to start after Hyde and Poyer are gone. So my confidence level right now in the safeties is really, really low. And we've outlined the challenge the Bills have to start the season with Kyler Murray and then that Miami Dolphins offense 5 days apart. Holy cow, that is not a position I feel good about the Bills having questions about.
Oh, 1000%. The thing with Damar Hamlin to me is pre-incident, if that's what we're labeling it here, he was still just kind of okay. We have a guy there. Like, I'm not saying a guy in the sense of excited. It's just someone that's serviceable. He was doing an okay job. He was fine, and then such a thing happened where now it's hard to get the idea out of your head of, is he fully there? Is everything going to be okay? Are there going to be instances where maybe he has an issue just kind of playing, we'll call it mindless, whereas you're not overthinking things and you're able to just kind of let yourself do its job as it needs to on the football field in play. I think it's one of those things where Damar Hamlin pre-situation, it felt like he was a depth player. That's what he was. And now there's nothing that should have changed my mind, I feel like, when it comes to where we sit with him now. All things considered, it's not like he somehow developed in this time where I'm like, okay, he can be a starter now. So the fact that we've fallen into this situation where he is, I don't know how you can feel very comfortable about it, to be quite honest, because you then add in, like you said, all of the images of the 2023 season with Taylor Rapp. There's not a whole heck of a lot to be confident about. Taylor Rapp can do certain things well. Playing deep safety like we had Micah Hyde and Jordan Poyer, that is not one of them that we've seen so far, at least in meaningful action. So it's not anything, by the way, that's going to change in the next 2 preseason games either. This is the kind of thing like I talked about even earlier. You can do incredible things in the preseason. It doesn't move. You have to be Victor Cruz against the Jets to move the needle. That's what you have to be. You have to be a superstar in the start of a game where all of a sudden you have hot clips of who the heck is that guy? Because clearly NFL coaches are like, why is he your 7th string receiver? That's what it takes to then take my attention and be like, okay, maybe you are something. Preseason, it's almost impossible to do such a thing. And therefore, I don't care even if Taylor Rapp is, looking like Ronnie Lott out there and just destroying everything that comes in his path, as well as being a good coverage safety on top of it. Like, it's the preseason. I need to see it in meaningful action. I need to see it against Kyler Murray and Maserati Marv week 1 in your house. That's when I need to see it, because if it happens then, I'll be a little bit better as we go into that Thursday night against Miami. But with Damar, with Taylor Rapp, with whatever the safety situation is, I don't feel good. I think a lot of people are in the same boat where it doesn't feel like something right now you should be feeling great about, because Damar is going to make this roster. He's probably going to be your week 1 starter, and you're going to have to live with that next to Rapp and see what happens.
It'd be tough. Thank you, Chris, though, for chiming in with that question. We always appreciate interacting with you. One very frequent response I got, Luka, to your question of what has changed in a significant way. The overwhelming amount of people who feel great about the Bills wide receiver group. And look, I mean, they didn't go nuts on Saturday. Who cares? We've talked about that. Like that Josh Allen threw 3 passes. The runway was not there for them to go nuts. I get it.
Right.
Disney Wife, another one of our favorites. I kind of always thought this, but I think their receiving core is fine. And along those lines, another guy we interact with a lot, Matthew Rose. Where are you at? Here we go. I feel good about Curtis, Shakir, and Coleman leading this receiver group. And then A-Rod Walker, Mr. I am the law. Buffalo does not need to invest any further resources into the wide receiver this year. Okay. I was listening to Joe Biscaglia's podcast while I was mowing the lawn today, and it came out prior to the preseason game, but it was kind of his training camp wrap-up podcast. And if you listen to our show, like Joe Biscaglia to me is, I think he has the best feel for like what's really going on in that building and like what the Bills are thinking about certain things. And his read on the receiver core is he really does think that despite the fact that there's names like Brandon Ayuk out there to be available, he thinks that the Bills really are going to look at 2024 as let's see what we have before we go out there and decide we're going to add to it. You know, potentially, maybe you get 6 games into this season and you feel like, hey, our team's good. Receivers kind of holding us back. Let's make a move. I don't know what move would be available at that point. I doubt it'd be Ayuk, but who knows? But I think more so we're looking at like this is what the Bills have, and we'll readdress it next offseason when some of these names we've been hearing about do become free agents, and playing with Josh Allen could be appealing. The receiving core in general, Luka, I have my reasons why I am slightly more optimistic, and I say like slightly more optimistic than I was before camp started. Have you moved off your spot at all, good or bad, on this receiving group since camp and then, a week into preseason?
No, I think I'm pretty. They are what they are, and I believe that to be the case. In nothing, it's going to be a repetitive theme here, folks, for the next
Yeah.
couple weeks. Nothing's going to really get me off that mark. Again, you have to be Victor Cruz against the Jets in preseason. That is the baseline benchmark, Josh, for me to see preseason action and for it to literally change my mind on a player and a situation on a team, or regardless of what position it is. So, it's not like I'm saying that because I'm negative on the receiving group. It's not like I'm overly, excited and hyped about it either. Not to say that I don't love Keon Coleman and I'm excited to see what's going on there. I'm excited to see what Curtis Samuel can be. There's that little bit there, but it's not like I'm sitting here realistically thinking that this is a better group than what they had last year. I have no means to base that off of. In my opinion, it feels irresponsible almost to kind of come out with that, because on what factual foundation do you have to say that at any point in time? Because of these players when they played for different teams or not even in the NFL at a high-end college level, you're going to tell me that they are a better room than what we had last year? I'm sorry. That's going to be an extremely hard argument for you to win against someone like myself. And I don't think it's just myself who I'm a tough negotiator, I will say. But overall, I think that would be a hard sell for a lot of individuals because you don't really have too much to back that up with.
There are people out there that I respect as intelligent football fans that will tell you that this is the best group of weapons Josh Allen has ever had. And I just can't pretend like 2020 didn't happen, where the Bills had 2 all-pro receivers. I can't get there. I don't know what we're doing. And then the next year when they replaced essentially John Brown with Emmanuel Sanders, John Brown was still there, I believe, but just couldn't get healthy. Or maybe he left at that. No, he left. And Emmanuel Sanders, again, I get Dalton Kincaid is probably projected to be better than any version of Dawson Knox we've ever had. Stephon Diggs was amazing. You could make the argument he's the best wide receiver in Bills history. I would not go there, but you could make the argument. That guy has not been replaced by Curtis Samuel, the emergence of Khalil Shakir, and drafting Keon Coleman at the top of the second round.
Right.
Maybe it happens down the line. But I do have 3 reasons why I'm slightly more optimistic, and 2 of them are just like so tiny. And then one I think is somewhat significant. The tiny ones, Shakir. The story on Shakir, the last 2 camps were there would be like a good day and then a bad day, or a good play and then a drop. And you just didn't hear that at all during camp. He was a steady Eddie. And that does build on the second half of the year that we saw from Shakir when Joe Brady took over. And there has always been a concern in the back of my mind, if you're watching on YouTube where I'm pointing, that does Khalil Shakir kind of go the way of Gabe Davis, where it looks really good when he's the 3rd or 4th guy in the pecking order, but when he's expected to step up and be more of a focal point of the offense, you just don't get what you want. It's August, folks. We're talking about July and August, so there's no proof in the pudding right now. But as far as like seeing concerns in July and August, haven't seen that. I'm happy about that. Keon Coleman, you didn't hear any reports in camp about this seeming too big for him or dropping balls left and right. Did he have drops? Yes. Did he have days where he couldn't get open? Yes. But as far as like, oh boy, like They took him in the top of the second round, and he does not look ready for NFL action. That hasn't been the case. It looks like he's out there competing, and that's great. Doesn't mean he's going to be great, but at least it's not like, whoa, what is this? Like when Aaron Maben showed up and he looked like a wide receiver, and you're like, this is the guy we're going to sick on Tom Brady? This was our plan? Brian Arakpo was right there. I digress. Third one, I think this one's a little bit more significant. Curtis Samuel. I am very encouraged by what I'm hearing about how the Bills are utilizing Curtis Samuel as kind of a joker. He lines up in the backfield. He moves all over the formation. We did see the screen pass to him on Saturday. And the reason why I say that is, yes, I think most people when the Bills signed Curtis Samuel had that visualized as his role. But in the back of my mind, I think back to several Bills players where when the Bills acquired them, I thought about, oh, that'll be neat to see him used in these situations. And it never came to pass. When they trade for Naheem Hines midseason, it's kind of like, now here's a weapon we can unleash on the offense. And the entire rest of the season goes by, and all they can say is, well, he was new to the offense. He couldn't pick it up. What? I'm sorry, what? It's Naheem Hines. He's a veteran. How difficult is your offense? Quite frankly, last year under Dorsey, when they drafted Kincaid as this great tight end that was going to change their offense, and all they did the first 6 games was throw him 3-yard passes. James Cook, his first year, was never utilized as a weapon in the passing game. I feel like there's other examples there, even if you want to go on the defensive side of the ball. Luka, we've talked ad nauseum about how Quentin Jefferson seemed like a really good idea as an interior pass rusher, but they decided to use him as a nose tackle because Star Lotulelei was out with COVID. I understand you need a nose tackle, but don't use that guy. So, different people making those decisions. This is Joe Brady's offense, but I was concerned that maybe the most obvious answer to the Curtis Samuel solution wasn't going to be the Bills' answer. And so far, I feel like they have a good idea how to use him.
The last point with Curtis Samuel is the more, I think you called them out perfectly. First two, you're talking about the other two receivers. It's promising because you haven't heard the negative, and that's good. But the Curtis Samuel one does kind of have that splash to it where has this team finally figured out that they do need that OW, that offensive weapon, that utility weapon, and actually do it on a regular occurrence where there's tape and there's a situation where teams just don't know what to do fully to game plan for such an individual. Because you've pointed it out. There's plenty of recent examples where that was not the case. And, you even had people going back to like Isaiah McKenzie's tenure where it's like, oh, we can utilize him like that because you saw it maybe once or twice, maybe a handful of times throughout a large portion of a season. It's like, just because you see a guy do it 5 times a year doesn't mean that that's someone that you can depend on doing that. It entertains that idea in your head, and then you are intrigued by that idea. But then this team would never actually fully jump into that pool of thought where it's like, we need someone like that. Introducing Curtis Samuel, all of a sudden, it does seem like that idea is there. The connection with Joe Brady, of course, as well, and him, in fact, using him in such a manner does, I think, add to that confidence, Josh. It's just natural to go. He recognized it at this point in time. He's clearly going to continue to recognize it here, you would like to imagine. And then that's something it feels like this offense needs, where you have that kind of utility weapon that you will do with whatever you can. The thing I'll even add on top of that, just like nice sprinkles on a proper cone, I think Curtis Samuel is the best for that. But even if they wanted to, they could use Shakir in that kind of role as well. You can use other players on this roster in that same role. And I think that is also exciting in its own right. It's lesser about the player in this instance and more about just having that player and idea instilled on the offense. So in case, let's say, Curtis Samuel's missing 3-4 weeks, it's like, hey, all right, Shakir, for this time, you're now going to be in that Curtis Samuel role. We're going to now introduce whoever it is, Tyrell Shavers, let's just say, into some magical big slot role or whatever you want to do. Shift the pieces around so that you still have that kind of moving chess piece, offensive weapon, joker role fulfilled as then Curtis Samuel comes back. And I think that does quite literally exist on this roster in a multitude of ways. And that would be exciting to see because you really do need that moving piece around. so that the defense can't feel as comfortable understanding what they're seeing in front of them pre-snap.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's a good call out on Shakir. I think there's this idea that Shakir is like the slot only player, but there's a much better player in there. He's a 4-4 guy, and I think he's shown the ability to have some good run after the catch. I think that's very interesting. And then Kincaid and Cook are guys too that can line up all over the formation. So the Bills do definitely have a unique skill set of weapons here. Mafia members podcast. We really need to pray for a healthy season. After yesterday, I don't have much faith in our backups. I get it. The Bills got blown out much because the backups seemed overly outmatched by the Bears backups. Now, there were some mistakes in there, as happens. So I don't know that the Bears backups on any given day are necessarily 20 points better than the Bills, but it happens. So we can talk about it. I think it's interesting, Luka. I mean, the Bills are up against the cap. This was kind of a cap cleanse kind of a year for the Bills, that they made some moves to get right really for next year and kind of get through this year while still putting the best team out they can compete with. And when you get rid of a Mitch Morse and you have to slide David Edwards into the starting lineup, that is a depth piece that is no longer there. And Ryan Bates is traded away for a draft pick. That's a depth piece that's no longer there. Now it's guys like Alec Anderson and Cedric Van Pran Granger, the first off the bench, if something happens to an offensive line that was very healthy last year. At the wide receiver group we were just talking about, now Shakir was ready to come in anytime the Bills needed, Stephon Diggs or Gabe Davis needed a blow. Mac Hollins might be that guy this year. And I know Mac Hollins is a guy that's getting a lot of love from Bills Mafia, but if you just look at his career, he's never been that guy that you're really going to get excited about Mac Hollins coming on the field. I think Marquez Valdez-Scantling is capable of some splash plays, but if he has to play, say, like significant snaps for this team, I don't think you feel great about that. So I'm not going to go through the entire depth chart, but I think this point here, Luka, is pretty valid, that one of the downstream effects of the roster reconstruction the Bills had to do is they had to make room for more rookies on their rookie deals, and that will eat away at your depth.
When you reconfigure the roster and you do it in such a, I don't want to say drastic, but in such a large swoop kind of way that the Bills did, I think the story that people wanted to pick up was, how are they going to recover from all of this when it comes to their starting production and things that are going to happen? Well, the good news is, at least offensively, we'll say you have Josh Allen, and Josh Allen should be able to hide a lot of holes that you've kind of exposed or maybe created or whatever you want to call it, and done by that large swoop of moves. What's not talked about is just like what you said. You're creating a depth problem. You're creating a reshuffle of the deck in the depth area. Where I kind of panic less in this, if you're really testing your depth at a certain point, you're probably all of a sudden, at least as a fan, I'm no longer expecting to see win after win. I think there's kind of this, it feels like there's kind of a misunderstanding of kind of, okay, the Kansas City Chiefs, obviously they are the pinnacle. They are the standard right now in the NFL. I don't think anyone's going to question that. But if the Chiefs kind of have a little bit of an injury crisis, I don't think anyone out there is going to be like, well, they're still okay because they have the best depth in the NFL too. It's like, on what? Based on what? I please tell me how you are evaluating their second and third stringers any different to anyone else in this league. That they're depth for a reason. They're unknowns for the most part when it truly matters. And if you're really dipping deep into that pool of depth, you're probably not having a large sustained success from that point on. My personal kind of recollection of this is, I believe it was 2014 Cardinals. That one team that they went 5 QBs deep. They still won 11 games, but had the most miserable playoff game of all time against a losing record Carolina Panthers in Carolina. And I think they had a total of 67 yards on offense. It's like, it's because they started 8-1, but then all of a sudden injuries just stacked up so much that you are really depending on depth, and depth is not going to get you across the line much more any further. And then as you see it in the biggest stage possible, look, that's a 4th string quarterback. That's a 3rd string linebacker. That's your backup left tackle. Like, when those things are happening, people, you're not going to be successful in this league, even against a 7-8-1 team that is hosting a playoff game. That is how they are still starters in the NFL. They're probably better than those individuals you're across from. That's the nature of the beast. So I understand where it's like, hey, everyone needs to hope for a healthy season to find success. That's how this works. So I'm not going to sit here and panic because the depth looked bad in a preseason game. It's depth. That's what happens. I mean, it's a little harsh, the comment you made earlier in this exact episode, but some of those guys might be driving a milk truck later on in this 2024 calendar year. So that's the reality of the sport at this time of year, and it is what it is.
You know, one of the other positives I have right now that maybe my opinion's changed, speaking of depth, is I feel like that 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. I feel like there's a realistic chance all 10 of these draft picks make the roster. And I don't think it's just a token Brandon Beane doesn't want to part with a draft pick thing. I think all of these guys will have meaningful roles. Like Keon Coleman's going to make the roster, going to be a starter or at least a top 3 receiver. Cole Bishop going to make the roster even if he starts the season on short-term IR. Dwayne Carter, 3rd round pick, going to make the roster, be in the D-line rotation. After that, though, Ray Davis projected to be the 2nd running back on this team. Cedric Van Pran Granger. I think people saw Alec Anderson play center on Saturday, and their first question was, how quickly can Cedric Van Pran Granger be ready for 2nd team center? Edifan Olafishio. We haven't seen much of him. He got hurt in camp, but Joe Biscaglia said there is no shot the Bills are going to subject him to waivers because he is an athletic freak, and I think they eyeball him as somebody who is going to be one of their best weapons in this wild new kickoff rule that we are living in. Javon Solomon. This is a name I think we all need to start paying a little bit more attention to because of the players that I came away with on Saturday that I was most excited about. Javon Solomon's at the top of the list, and I don't think it's that close because we knew he had the pass rush ability, but he showed well on the edges in the run game, like the only guy on the Bills that really looked well on the edges. That's not true. I think Cameron Klein had a couple good edge holds, but that's not the point. I think Javon Solomon is a guy that really has a chance to grow into something. Am I saying he's going to be the next Von Miller? No, I'm not. But I do think there is a ceiling there that's pretty exciting on a Bills team that could really use a high ceiling on an edge player because I do think that a lot of these guys are low floor guys instead of high ceiling guys that they have in their edge room as far as their pass rush ability. He's going to be active on game days, I believe, or at least should be, and could be that guy to come in and give them some juice on 3rd down. Tylen Grable, another guy that I think is going to be that 4th tackle on the roster, maybe not matter too much this year, but if injuries happen, I think you could see him be in there. And then Daquan Hardy, a guy that played boundary on Saturday, played slot on Saturday, and he's right in the mix of the returner job. You know, he had the mistake of fair catching the ball on the 2-yard line. It seemed like all the returners struggled with the wind except for Isabella, who got used to it last year. McDermott even said in his press conference that they need to get out to the stadium more often. That's correctable. Luka, all these guys are going to make the squad. 9 of them. Travis Clayton's not making the squad, the international exception. He's going to be on the practice squad. The Bills don't even have to burn a practice squad on them. The rest of the 9, I think they're all going to make it. And if we're talking about depth, maybe this year depth takes a hit. There's a real shot, Luka, that next year we look at this roster and we look at the 2024 draft class as like a foundational draft, similar to the year that the Bills got Taron Johnson, Saran Neal, who mattered for this team a lot on day 3. And it's just like, these are the kind of drafts where it doesn't seem like much right now, but these could all be important players for the Bills, you know, on a variety of levels.
You can't maintain a certain level forever. People age, people have injuries, things like that. And again, being this front office in general, they made a big swoop. They looked at it, they evaluated the cap situation, they evaluated the future projection of this roster, and ultimately they believed it was in their best interest to kind of on a one big swing really take a hit at the veteran presence that they had currently with the previous, or not currently, but with the previous regime, and understanding what they had in draft capital going into this season, what they then used it for. I don't think that's a stretch of kind of a call out there. I think you need those things. Organizations always need those things. If you fail to kind of have drafts like that, Josh, you will never find success. It just won't come because you always need to build foundation through the draft. You don't build. This isn't the This isn't the Yankees in the MLB where you can just buy whatever you feel like to create your roster and turn it over however you need to. The NFL does not work in that way. You need to eventually have it homegrown and work. In my opinion, that's why you have an organization like the Packers, who they don't really sign free agents too often. They will once in a blue moon, and it's not normally the splashy signing, but they just recognize something that they need to go out in the market and address because they just still continue to not do it in the draft. But overall, they build through the draft, they home grow everything, and you just notice that that foundation remains at a certain level that when the turnover comes, they've already gotten those kinds of situations done. And of course, the crown jewel of that example is going from Brett Favre to Aaron Rodgers to where they're currently at now with Jordan Love. There's a reason it's found success. There's a reason it works that way because it's truly the best way to do it. That's just how it works. And this could be that for us if you're trying to put a positive spin on things. And I don't think it's kind of a reach to do so. If it's, there could be growing pains this year. It might not be the cleanest thing, but you can't win all the time 11 plus games. Although I do believe, spoiler alert, that this team can still, of course, do that, even with all of these younger bodies making the 53-man roster.
I initially thought they were going to win 11 games, and they lost to Chicago. I got them down to 6. Just kidding. This one's big. Kyer Elam looking good. I think that's a great point. I think in June, a lot of us were just kind of like, maybe. And Kyer Elam is a guy that has been rotating in with the first corners. And I want to implore everybody listening, don't judge Kyer Elam on a success-fail basis by how much playing time he gets this year. Not being ready to take a job from Rasul Douglas and Christian Benford is not the same thing as not improving. Those guys are excellent. I mean, I think I said on last week's podcast, I think there's a very good chance that by the end of the year, we're talking about Christian Benford as one of the best players on this entire team, not named Josh Allen, who's in a different stratosphere. I really think he's that good if he can stay healthy. And Luke has been pumping the tires on Benford since the very first time he laid eyes on him in preseason. So I think there's a world where Kyer Elam gets much better, but still doesn't play a lot because the Bills maybe stay healthy at cornerback. But this is a win for the Bills, a position that we had to question the depth of going into training camp. And now you have Kyer Elam playing very well. You have Daquan Hardy looking like he can back the Bills up at boundary and at nickel. The Bills look like they're in respectable shape there. And for an offseason that saw Tre'Davious White leave, that wasn't necessarily something that we were prepared to just be, and Dane Jackson leave. I knew there was a name I was forgetting. And Dane Jackson, like the first guy off the bench that we all took for granted when he was here. The Bills are in really good shape here and potentially better shape than last year. Time will tell.
Yeah. We talked about it. Was it last episode or maybe 2? The corner, they just fell into this almost perfect world when it comes to their boundary corner. We're just going to say corner position in general, because it really is just that overall. You can include Taron Johnson in your nickel position as it is. It's fascinating to me because it does always feel on even teams with elite corners, right? They get to a place where they have that one guy, the island, whatever it is, your Sauce Gardner, your Stingley Jr. I think he's not quite there, but I just love him anyways, that I'll throw him in that group. Those guys, you have them out there. You're Jalen Johnson. You have these guys.
Who's that guy that's locking up Keon Coleman? Oh, nobody.
You have these guys that can be trusted and relied on, and they're going to do a good job. But like my whole thing is Patrick Peterson for years and years and years in the desert, just an absolute beast. But unfortunately, that guy that was across from him was like, why is this guy your corner too? Like, how is this guy starting on a team and a defense where it just feels like you're just one above average corner away from being a top 3 defense, absolute shutdown, and no one's throwing it on you? Somehow the Bills have found themselves in a situation where it's like, do they have a top 5 corner in the league? Probably not at this moment in time. I'm saying probably because I don't believe it's that case, but I also don't want to, be too griping there. I think it's pretty safe to say Rasul Douglas and Christian Benford are not that, as much as I love them. But them together, plus a successful Kyer Elam, with then also adding into the corner mix, Taron Johnson, I find it very difficult to look across all 32 rosters and believe the Bills aren't a top 5 corner unit as a whole in the
Mhm.
league. I think it's very sound, and it's super dependable right there. The only questions you really have are Christian Benford's health, and has Kyer Elam truly figured it out, which both health is health. There's no way to know if it's finally, it's going to work out, or if for whatever reason Christian Benford just is unlucky as can be. And then with Kyer Elam, time will just continuously tell. So it's a great spot to be for the Bills. And it's one of those things where you lose an all pro and Trey White, he goes. Now, what we had probably the last 2 years or so was not the Trey White of all pro. It wasn't even close to it, to be all honest. So it's an exceptional place to be when you include that in this equation. If you say we lost an all pro and yet somehow we're kind of smelling the roses with our current situation.
Kyer Elam on Saturday played 23 defensive snaps. 15 of those came in coverage. And I don't mean this snarky when I say one of my positives was 15 pass coverage reps, and he didn't have a penalty.
Yep.
And that's not nothing when you've known his career. And that's a physical, big wide receiver group on the Bears. And I know he wasn't in there the whole time that Keon Allen and DJ Moore were out there, but Dunze got some run, and they have a good group down the line. And hey, that's a step in the right direction. So win for Kyer Elam on that regard. You'll appreciate this one, Luka. I kept it in there just to make you laugh. Learn to think, one of our favorites. We are so much closer to complete disaster than I initially thought. I think you would probably know better than me. This is probably more tongue in cheek, but I think there's probably a segment of fans out there that maybe believe that. Um, I think there's a world out there where this could be disastrous. I mean, the obvious one is Josh Allen gets hurt, and that can sink any team's battleship. Otherwise, it just feels like that if Josh Allen's your quarterback, the floor is just so high that I'm not sure where disaster comes in, unless it's a situation where it's, off the field stuff that you just can't really sit here and predict. It's hard to imagine even looking at this roster objectively as I try to, Luke, and think, for the last 6 years, this does seem to be like the least top heavy Bills roster that I can remember, where they don't have like those 5 or 6 studs that other teams look at and say, man, how much help does Josh Allen need? Like there's no Diggs in his prime. There's no Von Miller coming over on him. Well, there's a Von Miller, but not that one on a massive deal. They don't have like the 2 safeties that people are looking at as like the best safety tandem in the league. They don't have an all pro cornerback in Tre'Davious White. They don't have this up and coming linebacker and Tremaine Edmonds, who was a first round pick that people are super excited about. I get it. But I would stop short of saying disaster just because really of 17. And honestly, I think McDermott too deserves some credit for that.
I think there's 2 ways to look at it. One is the way you kind of painted it out, right? In the same regard, my other is also the same, but the counter argument is you're closer to disaster because those 5, 6, 7 handful like stars, you're down to just 1, 2, maybe 3. So an injury is greater complete disaster. I think that
Mhm.
would be the counter argument to it, right? You we say it at almost ill levels where it's like if something happens to 17, we're doing like doesn't matter. Nothing matters anymore. We're looking forward when we're talking obviously like drastic injury. We're not talking just missing a week, whatever it is. We've seen that potentially happen, although he's muscled through a lot in his career already. But if a greater injury occurs to 17, that is complete disaster. That is your route. I think the counter argument, or to kind of support this statement, if it weren't to be like the most tongue-in-cheek situation, is you you can't even talk yourself into, well, maybe Diggs and of those times like Vaughn could step up and still somehow win an ugly game for us. Diggs could still kind of get, in this case, Trubisky through a game just by being the stud that he is, stuff like that. Like, where is that avenue if for whatever reason, let's say a 4 week span comes? How are we getting to 2-2 in that span? I think it feels a lot less likely
Yeah.
this season than it has in previous. And that's maybe where this tweet, this statement becomes a little bit more real and less of a joke or tongue in cheek or just trying to be, a little bit thoughtful in that sense.
I mentioned a lot of names and the names off the top that are gone. And I will say, and I hope you all know that if you're new to our show, we appreciate the hell out of you watching. So maybe you haven't been with us the whole ride, but Luka and I, we try to keep it as real as possible. If it's bad, we'll tell you it's bad. If we have a bad feeling about something, we'll tell you. I think even if you want to live in a world where you still think Stephon Diggs is a superstar, and I think that's fair to do that, I'm like on the edge of that world. I'm like right there where I could be talked into either way. I think he's the only superstar they lost this offseason. All due respect to Jordan Poyer, who I think is a Wall of Famer, the second he can go up there, and all due respect to Micah Hyde, who we all know like how important he is to the show as far as like what we feel about him. Tre'Davious White, the best cornerback, I think, in Bills history. I got into a little bit of an argument with somebody about some guys from the 90s, but hey, it is what it is. Wasn't those guys were not at those peak levels last year. Mitch Morse to me is a guy that is maybe more valuable for what he meant for the rest of the offensive line, but was never considered like a top of the roster guy where the Chiefs are looking at us and saying, the Bills are a team we own, but man, they have Mitch Morse. Like that's just not a world we live in. So I really do look at it as like, does the loss of Stephon Diggs equate to 4 wins? I wouldn't think so. I think the emergence of Shakir, the drafting of Keon Coleman, the second year of Joe Brady, the fact that Josh Allen's there to elevate it all, the emergence of Dalton Kincaid should help supplement that, if not even exceed that. But that seems like a lot to be optimistic for at this point in time. That's where my optimism comes in is, yeah, we lost a lot of names, but I don't think last year's roster was as top heavy as it appeared from the outside looking in. I think last year's roster was more about the sum of the parts and just hopping on the back of 17, which they are certainly going to have to do this year.
I'm gonna kind of compare what this all feels like right now. What it feels like is if you like to just splash in investments and stocks and just kind of the daily market, right? If you like to do that and you pay attention to something, you're really riding the highs of a stock. And we're going to say that stock started soaring in 2019 because that's realistically when Josh Allen's good professional career began. And as it's been climbing and climbing and climbing and such, last season finally felt where that dip came in a week span of a stock where you had to truly wonder, where is it going to go from there? Is this the time to sell? Take your profits for where it is and kind of move on with your life and you don't have to worry about it anymore? Or are you going to ride it out and have what feels like the potential for it to continue to dip and see what happens? What I really believe is happening, and based off of what you're saying, I'm in agreement with, is we might see post sale of that stock it to creep up in a day or two, but eventually that's going to fall a lot further. And this is going to look like an overall win in, say, by the end of this season into next season and such, where you had to just make that decision and kind of, you can't half ass it. You have to fully commit to the plan. And this is the plan. And it seemed like an appropriate time to do it. You cut your losses, or in this case, you cut your wins and just move on to a new generation and try to shift the generation forward. And it comes at a cost of Diggs, Morse, the safeties, Poyer, and Hyde. You know, all of these individuals who have been along for the ride for a long period of time, staples of a McDermott and Bean regime, are now gone. You are replacing them or attempting to as best as you can, and you're moving forward because you believe that this is how you then turn your wallet into greater returns forward. That's how this works. And I'm with you. I think Diggs is probably the only superstar that left in that group. All due respect to all the other individuals. Even then, I can see a world where, I'll say this. When I'm hearing things about Diggs in Houston, and this is not meant to be a shot at all, because I think Diggs will actually be very valuable for that team, especially for his role. But when you start hearing a lot of veteran talk and he brings something different in a veteran sense to the room and all that kind of stuff, to me, that it paints a little bit of a picture on where their thoughts are about Diggs's role. And it's lesser on the field and it's more in the locker room. It's more in the meetings. It's more in the day to day. And I think there's incredible value in Diggs for Houston with that receiver room, with Noah Brown, with Tank Dell, with all of those guys. It's like you needed to bring in a Diggs to show them what it means to be a high-end pro in this league now, because they have the potential to be something special down there. At least they believe it. And I'm sure a lot of others believe it as well. And that's someone you hope to bring in a Stephon Diggs. And when you're hearing the coach talk like that, when you hear it kind of around the room and around the national media, to me, that's a pretty clear cut indicator that what's happening on the field is not as important as it used to be anymore. And you're really trying to grab his value elsewhere.
I've yet to see an evaluator say that he looks like vintage Stephon Diggs. The best I can see is he's not what he used to be, but he's still very effective. That's kind of where I fall. To be honest, I think he's still very effective. I do think there's something to be said for the fact that when Diggs was here, he was the first read on a majority of the plays. And then everybody else kind of had to fall in line. And as a competitor, I can see why, if you know you're the third or fourth read on like 7 plays in a row, why you wouldn't be like running as hard as you can on your route if you just know the ball's going to go to 14 barring catastrophe. And it does feel like this year the Bills are in much more of a anybody can get the ball on any play scenario. The coverage is going to dictate where the ball goes. We don't have to make sure Steph gets his catches. All the stuff that when you say it, it makes it sound like you're painting this picture of like a diva receiver, but it really is just if there's one guy at the top of the pecking order, it's just life in the NFL. You'd rather have that guy than not have him.
Mm-hmm.
But I think the argument is, was Diggs still that guy to justify that target share? I have questions. And will this bring out better versions of guys who were already here? And then guys like Curtis Samuel, Mac Hollins, Keon Coleman, who if Diggs was here, would just be role players in the Stephon Diggs show. So it'll be fascinating to see. There was a couple more I wanted to get to. I think that's a good place to leave it. After that, I think I don't want to beat this game to death. It was a not a pretty game by any means. To give you an idea of how little this game matters, I have no idea what happened around the league preseason wise, who won or who lost. And I am an NFL junkie. I wait for the NFL to come around nonstop. I could not tell you. The Patriots, I think, won. I know the Texans won. And then outside of that, like I know McCarthy for the Vikings had some good moments after throwing a pick on his first drive. I know the Notre Dame running back Estime, who I was like, why didn't we draft him when we took Ray Davis? Had himself just a miserable day in Indianapolis where he caught a ball and runs with it, and then it gets knocked out of his hands, but it still goes like an interception. And then he fumbled also too and lost it. And so outside of that, I couldn't tell you who won, who lost. So if you're worried, like the perception of the Bills is, oh, told you they stink. Nobody knows. Nobody's paying attention to final scores anywhere. Luka, any final thoughts before we get out of here and I guess turn our attention to Pittsburgh because our attention is going to be on another preseason game?
One eye on Pittsburgh because I think that's all that's really necessary in the preseason. Realistically, my thoughts will never change and stuff. I mean, even on your point, I think the funniest thing is estimate 10 carries, 31 yards a score, just looking at box score because I was curious. But then, of course, the story really is highlighting some of the, I'm not going to even call them blunders, but just the errors that had occurred with him involved. And then on top of it, and this is another reason why scores don't matter. The only thing I knew that came out of the Washington New York Jets game, the only thing I know is that people were lauding over how good Jaden Daniels looked and how incredible he looked. They lost that game 20-17, and he wasn't even the leading passer on his own team.
Thoughts and prayers, Commanders. Thoughts and prayers.
So, like, what does it all matter? It doesn't. Like I said in the beginning, it's fun to see a splash play or two. If you're a team or you're a fan, like someone for the Washington Commanders, and you see Jaden Daniels play, of course, you're going to get well excited. It's like, oh my goodness, did we just finally find our guy? Do we have another RG3 rookie season coming up? What could possibly happen? It looks incredible, but it's preseason. And you have to just try to keep yourself at that baseline and understand that quite literally almost nothing matters in that game more than just going through the motions, allowing the rookies to kind of experience NFL game days, get them acclimated, things like that. The stuff that isn't on the field, the stuff that's not the game day preparation. I think the funniest part to me was I think Allen and McDermott only had a couple things that were shared in mind, because even at one point, Allen said, I saw the mood in the locker room, but we haven't had a talk to yet, or something to that effect, because I guess he hadn't heard, or they hadn't heard by the time he was at the mic, what McDermott's thoughts were post game and so on and so forth in the actual locker room. But the only thing that both of them said that I found interesting was how they both made a comment about the rooks and the new guys to the league and how this was good for them to experience a game day process. And you know, this is what you should do on game day. This is what you do when you wake up. This is how you get to the stadium. This is what you need to do to get ready. This is going through warmups. Like, understanding the process of an NFL game day, because it is different than a college game day. This is something that none of these players have ever experienced. That is the value in this. And that is the most valuable thing probably that comes from this, is getting back to that game day feeling and everything of such, so that by the time you get to week one, it doesn't feel new. And although you're going to have excitement, of course, because that's when the games matter, but it doesn't feel new because you had just done it for 3 weeks previously. That's the most important thing that comes from this. It's not the score. It's not the play. It's nothing like that. The only play that would be concerning is if it results in an injury, and then it becomes concerning. So remember that as we go through these other 2 preseason games, ladies and gentlemen, it doesn't matter.
And the Bills came out of this one clean injury wise, as far as we know. McDermott should speak tomorrow, I believe, if there's any lingering effects from that. And one last tiny point, not even going to like kick it even back to you because I know we share a brain on this. I think we both like the Bears. I know we do. I'm not sure when we'll talk about them because they're not on the Bills schedule. And you and I both talked before we went on the air, and I told you, I was like, the biggest reason I'm upset it was a blowout is because now I sound like I'm overreacting to preseason when I'm like the Bears are a sleeper team, because I've thought the Bears have been a sleeper team for the majority of the offseason. You have too, when you kind of look at what they have on defense, look at some of the weapons they've given. And then the big part of the projection is how quickly can Caleb Williams hit the ground running, and is he ready for prime time in the NFL? And, you know, the Packers and the Lions are not going to be easy outs by any means. I just think when you project what the Vikings should look like, which is great for the Bills because the Bills have their 2nd round pick. So go whoever's playing the Vikings. I think there's a world where if Caleb Williams plays it like, 80% of what CJ Stroud did last year, the Bears could be very dangerous. And I like a lot about that team. And my opinion on that, Luka's opinion on that, is 0.0000% of anything that happened over the weekend. It's all about things that happened way before the Bills and Bears had an organized scrimmage on Saturday. But for Luka, I am Josh McCarty. We will be back next week to talk about all things Bills Steelers. Hopefully no more injuries. And hey, if you're the kind of person that likes these things, hopefully a win. I don't really care, but I feel like the fan base could use one for some morale. So we will see you next time on Bills Chat.